I am going to talk about how in Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins, anti-Semitic stereotypes are dismantled as Herschel defeats the Hanukkah Goblins, basically. And I think before I start talking about that, I need to talk about how recently I've been seeing a lot of stuff about how goblins have come to represent anti-Semitic stereotypes. And I did a little bit of research and a little bit of just thinking about things I have read, and I have come to the decision that a lot of that stems from the portrayal of goblins in the Harry Potter universe. For those of you who are unfamiliar, within the Harry Potter universe, goblins control the entire monetary system. They're in charge of all the banks, and they also run forges. And the things they forge, particularly mentioned in the series, are Fleur's tiara and the Sword of Gryffindor. Those things, they hold a belief that once the initial person who pays for an object has passed away, that object has to be returned to the goblins so the goblins can pass it down. They don't believe in passing down objects within the human race. If you think about that, it represents anti-Semitic stereotypes, because first of all, you have to mention the way that goblins are portrayed visually within the films and within the books. They are short, squat creatures with large noses. And if you have seen in history class, or I don't know how to put up pictures on video editing, so if you're able to do a quick Google for anti-Semitic, particularly Nazi propaganda, what you will notice is that the portrayal of Jews is squat, large-nosed, greedy. Because Jews were moneylenders, there has always been a stereotype of Jews being extremely greedy, wanting to control power, wanting to control wealth. There was, I remember my mother mentioning a Jap stereotype, and in this sense, Jap is not a derogatory term to Japanese Americans like it was during World War II, that era, but it is a derogatory term, Jewish American princess, and it's just rich Jews, people disliking rich Jews throughout history. That's always been a thing. And that idea of the goblins being in control of the wealth, wanting to pass things down only within their community, the way they're portrayed, it is, when you break it down, some of the connections are clearer than others. It is anti-Semitic. And I have also seen some things about the dwarves in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit being anti-Semitic, because they are also very greedy, very want to control their gold. I haven't read it recently, so if you have anything you want to add, feel free to comment that. I would like to hear your thoughts, or if you're viewing this on Tumblr, reblog it with your thoughts. I would be interested. But I did see something that Tolkien did derive the dwarvish language from either Hebrew or Yiddish. I can't remember, but there are some correlations there. So recently, a lot of the media we've seen has this anti-Semitic portrayal of the goblin. And whether or not that's something that's been portrayed throughout history in the way goblins are shown, depicted in literature and images, it's something that we're seeing now, especially with how pervasive Harry Potter is. With Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins, one thing I want to take a quick look at before I go into the plot line is just quickly looking at every time the illustrator shows a goblin, which honestly I don't have to do that because it's all in the back of the book. So if you look at them, I'm looking particularly at the large noses and how they're kind of fat. This is how we depict goblins. And in Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins, they are the bad guy, and they are defeated by the Jews. So I view that as a depiction of Herschel representing the Jewish people and fighting against and defeating anti-Semitic stereotypes. The plot of Herschel and the Hanukkah Goblins is that Herschel of Ostropol is walking around looking for a place to go, and he finds a village, and it's the first night of Hanukkah, but there are no candles lit. He doesn't smell any latkes. He doesn't see any people celebrating. He doesn't see anything that would tell him it's Hanukkah. So he goes to the villagers and he says, what's up with this? Like, why aren't you celebrating Hanukkah? And they tell him that there are goblins who have taken over the synagogue and they terrorize the people, particularly on Hanukkah. And they're just not allowed to celebrate because these goblins are stopping them from being who they are, from being the Jewish people and living their lives as Jewish people. And Herschel wants to know how to defeat these goblins. And they tell him it's not easy. You have to go up to the synagogue and you have to light the candles on the first 7 nights of Hanukkah. And then on the 8th night, the final night of Hanukkah, the king of goblins himself has to light all the candles. And every night that you try to light the candles, the goblins will come and they will try to defeat you and they will try to stop you. And Herschel decides that he's going to go up and he's going to try and save Hanukkah. So he goes up to the synagogue, and each night one of the goblins visits him. Within the book, there are 3 goblins, the first 3 that come. He's shown how he defeats them. And then on the last night, he also shows how he defeats the king of goblins. Or the author shows how Herschel defeats the king of goblins. So the first one, I don't have as much to say. Herschel defeats the first goblin because it's a teeny tiny little goblin. And Herschel defeats him by crushing a hard-boiled egg, and he tells the goblin that it's a rock, and the goblin sees that he's very strong and is frightened away. But then it's the next 2 that I'm particularly interested in because I feel that the largest anti-Semitic stereotype is about the greed of Jews. So the second and third goblins, the second one, Herschel defeats by inviting this goblin to have some pickles. And the goblin reaches his hand into the pickle jar, grabs all the pickles, and he can't get them out. And he's stuck by his greed. And Herschel tells the goblin that he will help him after he lights the candles. Herschel lights the candles, and then he tells the goblin that all he has to do is let go of the pickles. All he has to do is let go of his greed. Herschel has fought against and defeated the stereotype of greed. And then once again, the third goblin, they play dreidel. The way you play dreidel is there's a top that you spin, and on each of the 4 sides there's a letter, and you have a pot of candy is what we usually play with, but you could be playing with gold, which is what Herschel does. And what each of the letters that you spin on the top represents something you do with whatever in the pot. Hey is you take half of it. Gimel is you take all of it. Shin is you put one in, and Nun is you do nothing. So Herschel explains to the goblin how to play dreidel, but with the wrong rules, manipulating the goblin into thinking there's a chance of him winning, but in reality, Herschel is going to win. So this one's interesting because Herschel wins. He gets all of the gold. This is interesting because my argument here is that this is a dismantling of the anti-Semitic stereotype. This is him defeating it. But this is him being greedy in order to win. He's playing off of the greed of a goblin and defeating that greed, and therefore defeating that anti-Semitic stereotype that's been put onto the goblin. But he's also being greedy in a sense. And to me, that's saying that you don't necessarily have to worry about fighting against every stereotype, that it's okay if you fit into a specific stereotype for who your people are. And then on the last night, Herschel defeats the most powerful goblin of all, the king of the goblins, by tricking him into lighting all the candles because he doesn't let the goblin know that he's actually lighting the Hanukkah candles. And he defeats this powerful, powerful figure who has been controlling the lives of the Jewish people in this town. And that particular stereotype I feel he's dismantling is the idea of the power-hungry Jew, the Jew who controls the government, who controls the courts, who's controlling industries. That has always been a stereotype that has gone hand in hand with the stereotype of the greedy Jew who holds power and money. It's that symbolism. And when Herschel tricks this king, this all-powerful figure, he's defeating that power. He's overcoming the most pervasive stereotypes that Jews face. And I just think it's very interesting how a children's book, which growing up as a Jewish child, there's very little Jewish representation in literature that isn't Holocaust fiction. I'm going to go into a deep dive soon into Jewish representation in literature and kind of investigate all of that because of how little there is. But my point with this is that if you are growing up in a Christian household, there are so many Christmas books or books with Christmas scenes. There are very few Hanukkah books or books with Hanukkah scenes. And this is one that every person who is raised in a Jewish household, they're going to recognize, they're going to know. And it's this little idea that gets fed to children that you can defeat greed, that you can defeat power, that you can defeat squat little creatures with large noses. You can defeat this stereotype, this horrible, terrible, hateful stereotype of your people, that the Jewish people have the power to fight against that and win. And I think that's really, really important.